The perennial market share battle between General Motors Holdens and Ford warmed up a little with the release of the XD Falcon. As we saw last week, General Motors Holdens with their Commodore had stolen a march on Ford by releasing their car some months earlier and immediately capturing the imagination of the Australian public with a car which had quality and design that had not before been seen in an Australian product. But at that stage, no one knew what Ford had up their sleeve. And when Ford did release their XD Falcon, codenamed Blackwood, everybody was immediately most enthusiastic about it, to the extent that within months, those two cars, the XD Falcon and the Holden Commodore, were sharing market lead almost on a month-by-month basis, once with Ford leading and then once with General Motors leading. The reason was simple enough. Ford's XD was slightly closer to the Australian tradition of the family car. That is, a little bigger than the Holden Commodore. Very roomy, very spacious, very well conceived and designed. Ford's 3.3 litre engine is interesting in the fact that it even exists. It seems to me to be a fairly well-kept secret, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't know that Ford make a 3.3 litre engine. Traditionally, it's been sold to cab and hire car operators and to some fleet operators. There's never been a great deal of pressure from the sales or marketing staff to sell the 3.3 litre engine to the consumer. And I guess that's probably because there is a tendency for everybody to be convinced that they need to have the 4.1 litre six-cylinder engine or the 4.9 litre V8. And in fact, that simply is not true. We've elected to use the 3.3 litre engine for the very reason of being able to prove that the small six will do almost everything that the other engines will do perfectly adequately, with one possible exception, which I'll get to in just a few moments. In this case, we've elected to couple it to the optional 4-speed manual transmission rather than the 3-speed column shift, which simply is not as good to use, nor does it provide the flexibility of gear ratios that one needs with the slightly smaller capacity engine. I've begun this test in touring conditions because that's traditionally what these large cars were built for. And the first thing I have to tell you is that the 3.3 litre engine handles this sort of motoring excellently. But I must also tell you that it will not be hurried, no matter how you try to stir it along. There is no way that it could be called a hot performer. But that's probably no bad thing, both from an economy and a safety point of view. The other main area of concern with long-distance touring is driver and passenger comfort. And here the Ford comes up well. You sit high and firm, and the long wheelbase just cruises effortlessly over dips and humps. Added to this, the steering is light and positive. Wherever you go touring in Australia, you're going to meet up with rough bitumen and dirt. And in either situation, the Falcon does have a problem. The back axle is not effectively located and dampened, and in rough conditions, it actually bounces up and down. And you can sense that the rear of the car is moving about more than it ought to. That's something that can and must be cured. Otherwise, the overall road holding and handling are excellent. And the car handles rapid changes of direction neatly and easily. And it brakes just as well as the Commodore. No unnecessary lockup and no directional instability. For most of us, the majority of our driving is done in cities and suburbs, where ease of operation is almost more important than out on the open road. In these conditions, you'll notice two things. The first is that the gearbox and transmission generally are really excellent. Without a doubt, the best I've ever used in a big car of any kind. A very light clutch, one which is so easy to use that there is just no justification for going to automatic transmissions, and quite literally a fingertip gear shift mechanism which I find quite delightful to use, and nobody could have any complaints about it whatsoever. The second point is that it has a very large area of glass, and that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. An advantage from the safety viewpoint because you have excellent visibility, but a slight disadvantage from the comfort viewpoint because it lets in so much sunlight that the car tends to get very hot and stuffy. That, in turn, makes one think of air conditioning, and that means even less economy. If I were asked to make a preference between the Falcon and the Commodore, I guess I'd have to say the Falcon. In fact, the two cars are just about equal in a great many departments. Handling, for example, although the Commodore might have an edge as far as dirt's concerned. So that the preference seems to be in a somewhat subjective area. The Falcon certainly is a more pleasant car to drive, principally, I think, because of what I've already described as being an absolutely marvellous transmission, clutch and gearbox particularly. In other areas, they are comparable, and in one area particularly, they both have a problem. That's in the problem of fuel efficiency. The Falcon has an engine of 3.3 litres, which is only about half a litre bigger than that of the Commodore, in a package which is overall just a little heavier, yet they both manage to return the same fuel consumption figures of around 17 to 19 miles per gallon or 15 or 16 litres per 100 kilometres, somewhere in that figure, again depending on tune and the way you drive and all those other contingency factors that will affect your economy. Neither of which in fact is good enough, but it does suggest a marginal efficiency benefit as far as Falcon is concerned. When you consider town driving, however, we know that we must be able to achieve better than that, and particularly in view of the fact that, as you'll recall, the BMW was giving in the vicinity of 6 miles per gallon better than that figure. So there's still a long way to go there. One final little disappointment. Despite having come up with a completely new design, the Ford Motor Company have still managed to bury the spare wheel at the bottom of the boot, beneath all of this luggage. And although you don't get flat tyres very often, it almost always happens while you're on holidays and while you have a boot as full as this one. And that presents some problems for you.